So today, the two poets that I asked you to read and consider, Sylvia Plath and Audre Lorde, I think they offer us two perhaps different ways of thinking about the poet and also thinking about how the poet thinks about themselves, interacts with the world. In Lord's case, perhaps interacts with politics. But where I want to start is to actually encourage us to think back to Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. And I didn't talk about this in the Whitman lecture, but I want to now. There is this sense at the end of the poem, if you remember when he says, if you want to find me, look under your boot soles, right? There is this sense that Whitman has, if you don't mind the cliche, he's become one with nature. And if you think about the way we have talked about nature this semester, nature has been this entity that is not only unknowable, but for some writers, potentially dangerous, perhaps dangerous precisely because it's a mystery, because there's some degree of unknowability about nature and the natural world. But I think what we see, perhaps this reading that I'm offering, what we see at the end of Song of Myself is this sense that Whitman has conquered nature. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm using a word like conquer as if to suggest he has maybe colonized nature. It's not that, but he has bridged that gap, perhaps, and now he has this understanding. He as the poet has this power to understand things he didn't before. And I think what you see with Plath, and that's where I'll start, is a fundamentally different understanding of who the poet is, what their relationship to notions and concepts like power and knowledge ultimately are. Because in addition to turning inward, which is something, obviously, Plath was not the first poet to do this, but she certainly popularized it. When people think about Sylvia Plath today, they think about this deeply introspective figure, and she certainly does have that. But what I do like about Plath, and what I think is interesting about Plath in relation to some of these other poets we've studied, there isn't the same kind of power or the same kind of certainty that comes with being a poet. If anything, with someone like Plath, we as the reader, and I think Plath as well as the poet and at times as the speaker, we're all just left with more questions than answers. Again, there is no sense that there's real stability in Plath's poetry. And I think, again, one of the reasons why is because she doesn't arrive at the same kinds of answers and conclusions that, for example, a figure like Walt Whitman does. Think about how we certainly talked about Song of Myself in these terms, that Whitman arrives at a kind of certainty in response to this question, what is a blade of grass? You won't see that same kind of certainty with a figure like Sylvia Plath. And I think it's also worth emphasizing with someone like Plath. Again, I talked about how introspective she is. And I think one of the misunderstandings or one of the mischaracterizations of Plath, because she is this deeply introspective poet, and we often associate that kind of deep introspection with a kind of melancholy, and that's certainly there in Plath. I'm not trying to suggest, it would be wrong and disingenuous for me to suggest that Plath isn't at times a deeply melancholic poet, but I think part of what we do, and we do this, again, all of these ideas, they're just encapsulated in Plath, is this sense to be a good artist, you must be extremely morose and melancholy, and perhaps the trajectory of your life is one that will end in tragic premature death. And I think this is one of the ways where, again, you can see what happened to Plath the person, because she died quite young, she committed suicide. This biographical information about her bleeds into her poetry. And scholars have, especially scholars of Plath, have worked to disabuse people of some of these notions, because some scholars, some really smart scholars, have argued that Plath at her most productive was not when Plath was depressed, morose, or melancholic. It's actually the complete opposite. When she was most stable, that's when she was the most productive. So, one of the things that I want you to, again, if you had this idea or this notion of Plath, that she, like a lot of great artists, was just destined for this premature ending, this suicide ending, I would just disabuse you of that notion, because I think it has this effect of perhaps validating some of that behavior, and it has this effect of perhaps celebrating depression, but not for maybe the reasons that we should. And again, I want to be careful here. I'm not trying to suggest that if you are depressed, you shouldn't get help. My point is, when we take our understanding of perhaps depression and suicidal thoughts to the places people take it with Plath, I think it does so much more harm than anything else. And again, it's not actually true, especially in Plath's case. It's not accurate that she was her most productive when she was most depressed. In building on that, the poem I want to start with is Lady Lazarus. It begins on 622. I think we see in this poem Plath possessing a kind of awareness of how her depression and her suicidal tendencies, how for far too many people, it's become this spectacle, this thing to enjoy, this bit of entertainment. And I think in Lady Lazarus, there's also this sense that for some, yeah, again, she's almost this piece of entertainment or this bit of entertainment, but for others, in particular for these male doctors, she's just a special experiment to experiment on, and in that way she almost becomes commodified. So I think in Lady Lazarus, again, there is this clear sense that Plath understands perhaps how people think of her, and she's offering in this poem a rebuke of those ways of thinking about her. So follow along with me on 622. This is a longer poem, but as you can see, the lines are not that long. I have done it again. 1 year in every 10 I manage it. A sort of walking miracle. My skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. My right foot a paper weight. My face a featureless fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin, oh my enemy. Do I terrify? The nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth. The sour breath will vanish in a day. Soon the flesh, the grave cave ate, will be at home on me. And I, a smiling woman, I am only 30, and like the cat, I have 9 times to die. This is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments the peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see. Them unwrap me hand and foot, the big striptease. Gentlemen, ladies, these are my hands, my knees. I may be skin and bone. Nevertheless, I am the same identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. The second time, I meant to last it out and not come back at all. I rocked shut as a seashell. They had to coal and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls. Dying is an art. Like everything else, I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I've a call. It's easy enough to do it in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It's the theatrical comeback in broad day to the same place, the same face, the same brute, amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out. There is a charge. For the eyeing of my scars, there is a charge. For the hearing of my heart, it really goes. And there is a charge, a very large charge, for a word, or a touch, or a bit of blood, or a piece of my hair, or my clothes. So, air doctor, so, air enemy. I am your opus, I am your valuable, the pure gold baby that melts to a shriek. I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir, flesh, bone, there is nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. Ere God, ere Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. So, something of a triumphant ending there. But I wanted to go back and just make a couple of observations. First, in those opening stanzas, I want you to notice the sheer number of references to domestic objects, a paperweight, napkin. Am I missing a few others? I think there might be. But notice how she seems to be grounding her identity in these domestic objects, and there's always this sense that she's trying to escape. She's trying to escape something, maybe escape her body in some way. But then after the stanza, there is number 3, what a trash to annihilate each decade. We have this 3 or 4 stanza section where she starts to develop this idea. It's something that I mentioned a moment ago, that she's really this object, this thing that people want to see and watch and just perhaps enjoy the crash and burn. What a million filaments the peanut gallery, the peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see them unwrap me hand and foot, the big strip tease. Gentlemen, ladies, these are my hands, my knees, I may be skin and bone. Nevertheless, I am the same identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. So again, there is this sense that suicide is, or perhaps specifically her suicide, is something of a show. And then later on the page, you'll notice she describes dying as an art. Dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. And perhaps you could pause over this and think, well, what does she mean? And also, in particular, what is her tone here? Because I think there's almost a sense that she's winking at us, the reader, a little bit. You could almost read a bit of sarcasm here. I think this is something that I like about Plath. She's a bit sarcastic. Her humor, it's this kind of caustic humor, because again, this idea of dying as an art, and perhaps you could even use a word like mimicry. Dying is like mimicry, or dying well is really putting on a good show, perhaps. And she even says that she's quite good at it. She does it really, really well. But onto the next page, we start to get a sense of who, perhaps for her, for the speaker, the true villain is. And it's perhaps the medical community at large, these doctors who, or this one doctor perhaps, who uses her again as perhaps this kind of experiment to experiment on. Perhaps she's not taken seriously. Again, she's torn apart and unpacked and then just put back together only to have it happen again. And once again, there is this sense that she understands the terms of this game, because at the top of 624, she speaks about how there's a charge or a payment for this kind of behavior, for this kind of activity. For the eyeing of my scars, there is a charge. For the hearing of my heart, it really goes, and there's a charge, a very large charge, for a word or a touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So again, she sees herself, or in this poem, perhaps, she starts to see herself as, again, maybe just a commodity, something to be bartered and traded, just a spectacle for other people's enjoyment. And it leads her, and again, she channels so much of this anger, and she channels perhaps the responsibility for this to this doctor figure, this air doctor. And again, you would be correct for noticing how she seems, and she does this with the poem Daddy as well. She conflates perhaps Nazism with these awful men who do these awful things to her. And I think I asked you in one of the discussion questions for this week, what do you make of all of these rather overt references to Nazis in her poetry? And is there something potentially insensitive about this. But notice again how she uses interesting and particular language to describe what she perceives to be her relationship to this doctor, or perhaps phrased another way, what this doctor thinks of her. She is his opus. I am your valuable, the pure gold baby that melts to a shriek. And I think that word opus is really important because that's another reference to something artistic. And opus is perhaps a classical composition that is for a particular composer their best work, their biggest work, their most important work. So she even starts to see again herself as nothing more than an art object, something to be sculpted by the hands of this artist. And her reaction to it is understandable aggression. Look at the end of the poem. Ere God, ere Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. And I think positioning this poem in 1966 is perhaps important because I think she's talking about men as just authority figures, because she was very much a woman who was subjected to the rules and the restrictions of a patriarchal society. And so men were the authority figures in this world. And you can see her directing a lot of her anger, a lot of her vitriol toward these figures. And Plath, I didn't mention this before, she's also thought of as this extremely important feminist poet and feminist writer. And I think this is one of the places where perhaps we see that, where she's attempting to perhaps unpack and expose some of the problems or some of the injustices of living in a world as a woman when men, and quite frankly in 1966 only men, are in positions of power, authority, and influence. So let's transition now to Daddy. And this poem begins on 626, and I think you could argue Plath offers a similar sort of critique in Daddy that she offers in Lady Lazarus, but here she's directing this critique at, in theory, her father. And I think I mentioned this in the discussion forum question about Plath for this week, but her father wasn't actually a Nazi. So it's interesting that she cloaks him in all of this Nazi iconography, and she does even more than that. She just frankly calls him a Nazi. And again, that's something I'll return to throughout this conversation of this poem. But again, it's on 626. Follow along with me. I'll read the whole thing. You do not do any more black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or achoo. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time, marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one gray toe big as a Frisco sill, and a head in the freakish Atlantic where it pours bean green over blue in the waters of beautiful Nauset. I used to pray to recover you, ach du. In the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, 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 but the name of the town is common. My Polack friend says there are a dozen or two, so I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It stuck in a barbed wire snare. Eek, 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 eek. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you, and the language obscene, an engine, chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna, are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck and my Tarak pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I have always been scared of you, with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat mustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue, Panzerman, oh you. Not God, but a swastika so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist. The boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that. No, not unless the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20 I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year. 7 years. If you want to know, Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. So I think one of the first things you'll notice is just how this poem sounds, because she, perhaps to your surprise, carries this ooh sound throughout. She establishes it in the first line with words like do, you, and then even at the end of that stanza at you. And I would ask you just what effect do you think that has? Because that diction, again, it carries throughout. It has this kind of rhythmic quality to it. I had a student once say it reminded her of a nursery rhyme, but a deeply horrifying nursery rhyme. And again, Plath persuasively just carries or continues this rhythm throughout the poem. And when she says at the beginning, this is the opening of the second stanza, Daddy, I had to kill you, I think we're almost encouraged, especially after reading it. She's obviously not speaking literally. This is more metaphoric than anything else, but I think the question worth asking, especially upon reflection after reading it a couple of times, is, well, why did she need to do that? And she, I think, does an effective job of perhaps establishing just how outsized an influence this man had on her life. Again, in the opening stanza, in which I have lived like a foot, excuse me, you do not do any more black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years. So there's almost this sense that she's been trapped in this maybe identity, not just her own self-conception, but even her notion of what she should be in the world, who she should be. I think you could almost imagine that this is a poem about asserting one's agency and finding a way to do that. And I think one of the ways that we get this sense is near the end of the poem, perhaps around line 55 or so. But no less a devil for that, no not, unless the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. So she makes this reference here to her husband, Ted Hughes, and they did not have a particularly good relationship. He was not terribly faithful to her, and we almost get this sense that the trauma or the tragedy that her father produced, it was just carried or it transferred from father to husband. And so you could perhaps, maybe one reading here is to imagine that this is not just a critique of her father, but it's also a critique of this man, her husband, Ted Hughes, who in effect occupied that same space after she met him, after she married him. And it actually reminds me of this play, A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen in the play. And if you like this poem, I would encourage you to read it. It's not an American play, but it's still quite good. Nora, the main character or the protagonist, she in effect offers this same critique of her husband at the end of the play. She says, "I've never had an opportunity to really think about things for myself. I simply went from my father's house to my husband's house." And what she's ultimately suggesting is patriarchal figures for perhaps characters like Nora or perhaps poets like Plath. They frankly just are the same person, or they seem to not only occupy the same space, but they have distinctly similar qualities and characteristics. I think today we have something of a cliche. I think I have this right, that daughters often marry men like their fathers. And again, I don't know how true or accurate that is, but I think the point Plath wants to make here is perhaps not that she married a man like her father, but it's quite distressing to her how her husband just so neatly slid into that role or adopted some of the same qualities and characteristics that her father seemed to have. And I think here she's offering more than anything a larger structural critique and thinking about this poem as, in effect, a structural critique of power dynamics perhaps helps to explain why, not just in this poem, but in a lot of her poetry, and especially the poetry that I asked you to read for this week, she makes so many overt references to Nazis and Jewish people. And here she likens herself to a Jewish person. And again, I think maybe that's not the best choice to necessarily make, but I think by doing this, and I'm just, again, taking Plath and her analogy on its face, or I'm just offering perhaps commentary on what I think she was attempting to do, not necessarily suggesting that she should or should not have done it. I think it allows her to get to this place where she's offering something of a wish fulfillment fantasy for just at large people in oppressive situations, or a wish fulfillment fantasy for the oppressed. And if we, for example, return to that final stanza, I think we get a sense of this, and it's something she foregrounds earlier in the poem. But there's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, daddy, you bastard. I'm through. And so I think for someone like Plath, this sense that she again has killed her father, metaphorically speaking, it's this way of perhaps staging this bit of revenge by those who are oppressed, those who are in oppressive situations. Again, she's perhaps staging or dramatizing this revolt against those oppressors. And for her specifically, I think you could argue the oppressor, perhaps at large, is just the patriarchal figure. And perhaps again in that way, perhaps this is a critique of a patriarchal system and a patriarchal society, again published in 1966. So it's something that she had intimate and familiar knowledge about. So maybe the final thing I'll say, though, or the final point I want to make, just to get a sense of, again, some of the problems she seems to have with what this figure of the father seems to have for her. And again, I think she's certainly speaking specifically about herself. There is something introspective about it, but I think it has the effect of offering this larger structural critique is just this sense of paranoia. Again, this idea that she's constantly watched, or that all of her behavior is placed under a kind of scrutiny. And I think she starts to establish this metaphorically at the beginning of the poem, when you think about how she had always thought of herself as living like a foot in a black boot or a black shoe, and just how restricting and confining that might be if you just think about how shoes work. The way, again, a good shoe seems to just wrap itself around your foot, and if it's laced properly, if it's laced correctly, it's maybe hard to get it off. So there's something almost claustrophobic about it. But I think she makes a more direct and overt reference to, again, this sense of paranoia around line 50, maybe, when she writes about this picture she has of him. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in your picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that, no, not, and less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. So this notion of him as perhaps a teacher or a professor standing at a blackboard looking back at his class, again, I think it has this effect of producing this sense of paranoia, or it gives us the sense, again, that she feels as though she's constantly watched or placed under a kind of scrutiny. And again, maybe as the final thing I'll say, I think it's interesting, all of the different ways that all the different words or the different labels or the different character types or even archetypes that she attempts to use to describe and characterize her father. At some points, he's a Nazi, not unlike Hitler. At other points, he's perhaps an oppressive professor. Perhaps he's even a black shoe that wraps itself around her in a rather confining way. At other times, and again, I think it's interesting how the title of the poem is Daddy, but she doesn't actually use that word a lot. And thinking about how that word, how people often use that word, more often than not, it's a term of affection. And in Plath's hands, maybe not so much. And or perhaps because it's so often used as this term of affection, it's interesting how in the final two lines she repeats it only to then substitute it for something else. Oh, and I also meant to mention, I think she also uses words like vampire to describe him. But here are the final two lines. They always knew it was you. Daddy, daddy, you bastard. I'm through. And so I would encourage you to perhaps just pause and think about a word like bastard and how it has a particular sort of connotation to it. And I think that's perhaps where, for now at least, we'll leave Sylvia Plath and let's transition to Audre Lorde. So Lorde in her time, and I think even today, was and is a fascinating figure. She was a black radical feminist. And when people talk about Lorde, regrettably too often, they pigeonhole her into these different categories. It is true she offered something of a scathing and important critique of second wave feminism, in particular the way second wave feminism focused primarily on the plight of white women and ignored black women and just women of color, again, any non-white woman. But what we also see, again, I think it's really easy to just pigeonhole her off into these categories, but maybe more than anything, what I want you to think about when thinking about a figure like Audre Lorde is how she's able to blend poetry or aesthetics with politics and political concerns. I mentioned this earlier. If Plath was someone who retreated in and offered interesting bits of introspection that still had these larger connections. I think we see something similar happening with Lorde, but perhaps from a fundamentally different perspective with a fundamentally different set of concerns. And I want to talk specifically about Black Mother Woman on 687. So if you would follow along with me. I cannot recall you gentle, yet through your heavy love I have become an image of your once delicate flesh, split with deceitful longings. When strangers come and compliment me, your aged spirit takes a bow, jingling with pride, but once you hid that secret in the center of furies, hanging me with deep breasts and wiry hair, with your own split flesh and long-suffering eyes, buried in myths of little worth. But I have peeled away your anger down to the core of love, and look, mother, I am a dark temple where your true spirit rises, beautiful and tough as chestnut, stanchion against your nightmare of weakness. And if my eyes conceal a squadron of conflicting rebellions, I learned from you to define myself through your denials. So first, my apologies. You may have heard this fan that's near me. It just kicked on, so it might kick off at some point in a few moments. But let's go back to the opening stanza. I cannot recall you gentle, yet through your heavy love I have become an image of your once delicate flesh, split with deceitful longings. Notice the speaker offers an interesting confession here. I cannot recall you gentle, which is perhaps a way of saying her mother, her black mother, was an extremely difficult person. Maybe even a word like overbearing or unforgiving. I would encourage you just think about what are some synonyms for a word like gentle. I cannot recall you gentle, yet through your heavy love. That's interesting. Heavy love. Maybe that's perhaps what she's suggesting here is it was a love that was clearly visible. It is not like she's suggesting that her mother didn't love her, but it was a complicated love. It carried perhaps a lot of baggage. Maybe that's the word today we would use. It was a love overwrought with baggage. But notice how, as the stanza ends, there is this sense of hope or promise that seems to carry throughout the poem. We're almost driving to this positive affirmation of what this speaker has become. Yet through your heavy love I have become an image of your once delicate flesh, split with deceitful longings. So an image of your once delicate flesh, split with deceitful longings. And you'll notice this word split, I think, is important here because so much of Lorde's writing and Lorde's poetry is about how to be a black woman in the world is regrettably to not feel whole or unified. It's perhaps to feel split or bifurcated. This is something we spoke about, for example, earlier in the semester when we read W.E.B. Du Bois, his notion of double consciousness. I think you can see perhaps Lorde making a kind of reference to it here, but there's also this sense, again, your once delicate flesh split with deceitful longings, because there is perhaps something a bit ambiguous about what this phrase deceitful longings means. Is that perhaps a suggestion that her mother had particular expectations for her daughter, what her daughter could be, what her daughter should be, and it had this effect of perhaps distorting her, and perhaps we are encouraged to imagine that she really embodied that distortion in some ways. But then if we transition to the second stanza, when strangers come and compliment me, your aged spirit takes a bow, jingling with pride, But once you hit that secret in the center of furies, hanging me with deep breasts and wiry hair, with your own split flesh and long suffering eyes, buried in myths of little worth. So again, we see that word split returning in the second stanza, and I think ultimately what again Lorde is getting at, or what she's driving at, is this sense that to be a black woman in the world, in particular to be a black mother, to be someone who has black children, is a deeply precarious thing because of perhaps the fears, but also the expectations that black mothers have for their children. And you might pause and think, well, how is this different from, or you might ask, just as a way of exploring this in more detail, how is this any different from the expectations that non-black mothers have for their children or their daughters? And I think part of it, of course, we can't ignore the racial dynamics of this country, and in particular how to be a black woman in the world, it presents, according to Lorde, a unique set of challenges. And if you think back to what I said a moment ago about how part of Lorde's larger political critique was against, or it was a critique of second wave feminism, which prioritized the plight of white women, perhaps not at the exclusion of black women, but again, according to Lorde, and you can just find this in her essays and her speeches, she's quite critical of second wave feminism, which second wave feminism would have certainly covered not only her life, but Sylvia Plath's life, that it was a expression of feminism that seemed to value and prioritize white women over black women. And I think that's perhaps part of the critique she wants to make here. But if you think about what I said about stanza 1, the poem, it still drives perhaps towards something positive, and I think we see that in the final stanza. But I have peeled away your anger down to the core of love, and look, mother, I am a dark temple where your true spirit rises. Beautiful and tough as chestnut, stanchion against your nightmare of weakness. And if my eyes conceal a squadron of conflicting rebellions, I learned from you to define myself through your denials. So even though we are driving toward something that's more positive, perhaps more affirmative, it's not like all problems are resolved. It's not like this poem corrects all of the again, difficulties, challenges, and problems that her mother as a black woman faced and confronted, because that's not true. Those still linger. This is not a poem that tries to eradicate all contradiction, all conflict, etc. But it is one that seems to suggest that the speaker has found a way to synthesize perhaps the conflicting messages, and perhaps at times the love, but also the rather difficult expectations of her mother. She's found this way of synthesizing all of it into perhaps this beautiful monument. Notice she uses a phrase or construction like a dark temple. I am a dark temple where your true spirit rises, beautiful and tough as chestnut, stanchion against your nightmare of weakness. So this way, and I think part of what I like about this is how this dark temple, it's something to perhaps celebrate. There's something celebratory happening here. So again, I think what we're seeing with Lorde in this poem is again not a rejection of, or a correction of all of those conflicting messages and contradictions, but a kind of synthesis of it. But there's still this sense that again, this is not a poem that tries to correct all of those contradictions. Many of them still linger, but it is driving towards something more positive. And it's also this poem, again, about becoming. This is part of what I like about it. It's a poem where the speaker clearly tries to embody, not just as she describes it, her mother's spirit, but you can almost get this sense that she's trying to embody the spirits of the mothers, the black mothers that came before her. But again, there's also this sense, and I mentioned it a moment ago, that we have something unified, a kind of unified identity through difference, or through a kind of reconciliation of those differences, but a reconciliation that doesn't eradicate them. Maybe another way of saying it, or another way of thinking about it, is perhaps coming to a kind of understanding about these differences, these contradictions, these at least for the time impossible to reconcile problems and messages and expectations. So I think the final thing I'll say is this is perhaps a lovely poem about the expectations that mothers, and specifically and particularly for Lorde, the expectations that black mothers have for their black daughters, and she's not perhaps ignoring or Lorde's embracing how a lot of the trouble with those expectations for the daughter, it's not a situation where, hey, we just have these mothers who perhaps don't love us enough, or these mothers who don't care. It's informed by this larger social, cultural, political matrix that creates or has the effect of creating some of this conflict. And again, I think this is one of those places where you can see Lorde using poetry and aesthetics as a way of offering a larger political critique. So I think that's where I'll stop for this week. If you have any questions, please contact me. But this is Colin Cox for Modern American Literature.